Hi, I'm Chris Ralph, and today we're going to talk about a lesson in prospecting that's an important thing for every prospector to remember. It's a really good lesson, and we're going to use the famous gold and silver mining district of Tonopah, Nevada as the example. You see, the story begins almost 120 years ago when a guy named Jim Butler came through this area. Now, Jim was a rancher, and he had a ranch over at Belmont, which is north of here, and he had business at a little new mining district called Southern Klondike, which was south of here. And he was bringing stuff there for business, and he liked to go prospecting. Jim had heard of the famous, fabulous strikes that had been made in Nevada in the years before the turn of the century, and so he was always on the hunt in case he could find something that was good. And so as he was making his journey south to Southern Klondike, he decided to go a little bit out of his way and do some prospecting. And when he was up there, he found some quartz, and it looked good to him. It looked like it might be rich, and in fact it looked a lot like this material here. It had black on it and had some manganese, and Jim collected a couple of samples, and actually went up to an assayer that was in that Southern Klondike area, and he said, "Hey, I can't afford to pay to have these assayed, but if you'll assay them yourself, I'll give you a share in the mining claims that we'll get out of this." Well, the assayer looked at the rock and saw the black and the quartz, and it didn't have any copper or lead or other, ore minerals that he recognized, right? And so the assayer looked at it and said, "Jim, this stuff is worthless. It's no good. So I'm just going to toss it out and get rid of it." So he threw it out on a dump and didn't do the assaying, and Jim was kind of disappointed. So then on the way back to his ranch at Belmont, or near Belmont, Jim stopped at the same area, and really not very far from where I'm standing here, and picked up 8 samples and took them with him. He went back to Belmont, and there was a young lawyer there, a greenhorn, kind of new to Nevada lawyer. He'd only been here about a year or so, and just didn't know that much about mining, but he also, of course, had heard about the famous mining strikes made in the past in Nevada. And Jim approached him and offered him the same deal. "Hey, look, if you'll pay to have these assayed, I'll give you a good share in the claims." And so this greenhorn lawyer, because he did have a little bit of money, he wasn't super wealthy or anything, but he had some money, and he knew about the famous strikes. And the trick was, he didn't know by looking at that ore that it was no good. Okay, so he went and paid to have it, and guess what? The assayer found out, or the guy who assayed it for Mr. Audie, the lawyer, gave him sample results and showed that they were super rich. The worst of the samples had an ounce of gold and about 80 ounces of silver. The best of them had 5 ounces of gold and 300 ounces of silver. Those were amazingly rich numbers. And yet the assayer from Southern Klondike had said, "Nah, they're worthless. I don't even bother with it." But Tasker and Jim Butler found out that it was super rich, and they came up here in this very area behind me and staked 8 claims on the outcropping veins that were here. And the outcropping veins, one of them, you can see that hole behind me, that's a narrow hole. Yeah, that's where the vein was. That's one of the veins was there. But miners dug it all out and shipped the rich ore off to be processed and made a lot of money doing that. And in fact, anyway, when they came up here and staked the claims, Tasker Audie and Jim Butler and another friend that they brought in, a store owner, Mr. Broger, they brought him in, and they together mined 1 ton of rock, which is really not a huge amount, but it was a kind of a test. And they shipped it off to be processed, and it had to be hauled more than 100 miles in order to be processed. And then the results came back. They got a check for $600, which may not seem like a huge amount to you and me in our day, but in 1900, $600 was a lot of money. And there was a lot of mines in those days that were working ores that ran $20, $30, $40 a ton. Yeah, so $600 a ton was super rich by comparison. And they were all excited, and the word got out, and a lot of miners came up here, and Jim let out leases to some of the miners to dig the ore on the surface. And in fact, that's what those diggings are behind me, those open stopes. That's work that the leasers did, extracting that super rich gold and silver ore. And guess what? The lawyer, his name was Tasker Oddie, he went on to become the governor of Nevada and later a US senator. And of course, he was a very wealthy man. He made millions off the mines at Tonopah. But what about the assayer? The assayer who knew that this rock was no good. He knew that it was worthless, so therefore why bother to assay it? Because it's worthless. Yeah, that's the lesson for prospectors. Always keep an open mind. If your mind is closed and you've decided, well, you know what everything looks like and you know that something is no good, yeah, without testing it, if you don't test it and find out whether it's really no good or not, you may be just like that assayer who lost out on millions of dollars and millions of dollars from owning a share in the mines at Tonopah. And there actually were huge amounts of gold there. This district actually produced over 2 million ounces of gold and 150 million ounces of silver, an incredible amount of precious metal. And yet that assayer lost out because he knew that rock was no good. And actually, you know, the rest of the story with the assayer is kind of a funny one. A year or so after everybody knew that the ore here at Tonopah was super rich, he actually went out on the dump where he threw the samples, found the samples of Tonopah ore that he'd thrown away, and assayed them, and of course they came back super rich, unlike what he thought. And he went to Jim Butler and said, hey Jim, I assayed those samples like you asked me to, and yep, they're super rich, so give me my share. And you know, most people would have told the assayer to pound sand and take a hike. But Jim was a really good-natured guy, and he, of course, made huge amounts of money from the mines at Tonopah. And good-naturedly, he actually gave the guy $32,000 worth of stock in the company that mined these mines behind me. So in the end, the assayer made a little bit, but nothing like he would have made if he would have not known that the ore was no good. So that's our big lesson in prospecting, but we're also going to take a look today at the mines at Tonopah, the mills, how they operated, and to give you a little bit more and take a look at some of the ore from Tonopah, and you can decide for yourself if you think it's worthless. So anyway, join me and we're going to continue with that right now. Okay, so after Jim made his big discovery and things got going, people came in from all over, and you can see this is a map of the Tonopah mining district showing hundreds of claims that got staked. Now I'm going to show you Jim's claims. Jim's were right in the middle, and they cover all the outcropping veins in the district. So look toward the middle and look for the yellow. See the yellow highlight? Okay, so this yellow highlight is the area that had the outcropping veins, and of course the Tonopah mining company, Jim's company, was the most productive, but some of the other companies produced some really large amounts of ore. They actually, Jim's claims produced more than 2.5 million tons of ore, and a whole lot of gold and silver came out of those. But a lot of the claims around there did really well too, and some of the other adjoining claims to the east and north and south did pretty well themselves. Even to the West End company did really well too. So there were a lot of claims that had good ore that didn't outcrop on the surface, and Jim did really well, and so did a lot of the people that were at least in close to his claims. So after they found out that the ore was really rich and the veins were everywhere and really big and wide, large-scale mining started, and they built giant shafts like this and went down more than 1,000 feet. And the ore in places was 30 or 40 feet wide. There was just huge amounts of gold and silver here, and they mined for years and years, which made Tonopah probably the second most productive area for precious metals, at least in the early days, in the state of Nevada, second only to the great mines at the Comstock Lode in Virginia City. And so Literally, the big mines got going, and the best years of production were actually between 1910 and 1930, when there were thousands of people living here and working in the mines, and of course in businesses associated with the mines. And Tonopah was just really productive. And it all came out of that one little thing that Jim Butler found, those ores. I thought we'd take a look at some of the ores. You know, these are the ores that the assayer from Southern Klondike thought were no good. This is typical surface ore. I showed you some in the video, but this is a closer look. And you can see that it's got black staining from manganese and brown staining from iron, and there's vugs and holes in it, and you know, it's in some of these porous areas that the silver chloride gets concentrated, that contain the valuable silver in the ore. Now here's a sample that was collected and polished, and you can see this has a lot of that black manganese, and then you see some blue in some of the cracks. That's actually a copper mineral. There was a little bit of copper in some of the ores, and this particular one, the copper filled some of the cracks, and you can see it there in the sample. But this is, again, the white quartz rock with black manganese staining that was so typical of the near surface ores. Here's some other valuable black stained ore from the surface of the Tonopah mines. This is from the Tonopah Belmont Company, and this contained $800 worth of silver and $700 worth of gold, and that's at $20 gold, and silver are probably 75 cents. So pretty amazing stuff. Here's another picture of some surface ore from Tonopah. You can see the black staining on there. Again, a little bit different appearance, but this is also ore from Tonopah. Now, some of the rich minerals, as they got further down in the mine, they had perargyrite, which is a silver and antimony mineral. It's actually a deep red when it's fresh out of the ground, but it quickly oxidizes on exposure to light to this black color. But it's a rich silver-bearing mineral. Here's some other silver minerals, black silver minerals collected from one of the Tonopah mines. This is a mineral called stephanite, and it's also a silver antimony sulfide. These are some little specimens, but they were collected way back in December of 1907 when the mines were just getting really going. Here's some unoxidized ore. This is ore from deeper down in the mine, and you can see the dark colored sulfide minerals and not so much staining, but this is silver gold ore from deep in the Tonopah mines. Here's a sample from the Mizpah mine from deep down. This is a sample that's mostly sulfur minerals, mostly pyrite and galena and some of the other typical sulfide minerals that were in the ore. This is from the Mizpah mine. But it shows that there's some variation in the ores from Tonopah. You've seen different pictures with different appearances. They don't all look the same. Yet another sample from the Montana Tonopah mine. You can see this gives kind of a banded texture. You can see the stripes of the ore. Basically, different fluids rich in different minerals would come in over time. The fluids would change and deposit either quartz or rhodochrosite or galena or some other mineral, perargyrite or whatever, as the different fluids flowed through the opening in the vein. And again, showing the different appearances of some of the Tonopah ore. And finally, you know, this is just one of the many shafts and old mining dumps around Tonopah. It's worth visiting. It's a place that makes sense. So anyway, that's a good review of what some of the ores from Tonopah look like, and we'll go on to our next step, which is taking a look at the mills. Another amazing thing about Tonopah were the huge mills that were required to crush and process all the ore. Now, Tonopah didn't come along until cyanide was developed and able to do the job much better than some previous methods. But there were still a number of mills, and they were using stamps in those days. They hadn't developed some other system, so stamps were the main way that they crushed the ore. And this was a part of the great Tonopah Belmont, which was one of the larger mines. This was their mill behind me, and it worked 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, crushing rock with a thunderous loud noise, because every time one of these stamps dropped, it made a large amount of noise as it hit the rock, and there were stamps literally banging all day long, deep into the night, like I say, 24/7. So this was a big part of Tonopah, was the mill like this. There were a number of these mills. This was only one of them, and they processed a lot of ore that was good. Tonopah did have some really high grade in the early days that were mostly was shipped away, but later on they processed a lot of good ore grade rock that was able to be processed by cyanide, and a good recovery and a decent profit made. So these mills operated for years and years. And when the great mills finally shut down after decades of operation, it was basically the end of Tonopah. They'd processed the high grade rock, they'd processed the low but profitable grade rock, and they were down to low grade stuff they couldn't work at a profit. So you saw in the back of that video that there were concrete foundations behind me when I was talking about the mills. This is actually the mill that I was standing near, only this is not it as it appears today with just some concrete foundations. This is what it looked like way back in 1913, when it was running and going great and producing lots of ore and lots of gold and silver. So you can see these facilities were really big and really hosted a lot of operations and processed a lot of rock. Now they use stamping, which is a stamp mill process. And so let's take a look at this. Here is a stamp mill setup from the West End mine, which is another Tonopah mine, a different mill, but same kind of process. And there are vertical rods in each of these banks. You can see against the wall, you can see the vertical rods. The vertical rods weigh about 1,000 pounds each, and they have on the bottom basically a pulverizer that the rod gets raised up and then dropped down, and the gravity pulls it down and smashes the rock, and ore is fed into the box with the stamps moving up and down, and they actually move fairly quickly. Bang, bang, bang. They just go one right after the other, and there's a whole series of them, and so quite a bit of racket comes out of these mills when they're running, and they run day and night, as I mentioned. But this is the process, and so it was crushed by those stamps, and then at the bottom of the box there in front of the vertical rods, there was a screen and material that was small enough to pass through the screen, then pass down these slanted tables that you can see that go from the right to the left, and on those tables were actually sheets of copper that were covered with mercury, and any gold metallic gold that was in the ore was captured by sticking to the mercury on that sheet. Now, other materials that made it down and didn't get caught were then processed by the cyanide process. Big vats where they were mixed around with dilute cyanide, and the cyanide actually dissolves the gold and silver, and then the solution was captured from the slurry and the gold and silver extracted. That's how these mills worked. Now the mines themselves, you can see this is what's called a stope, and you see the long narrow working. Well, that's where the vein was. The vein went through there, and the miners would go through, and they'd use poles and trees and stuff to keep the rock from one side to attach so that they didn't fall off and have rocks falling down on them from above, because they would work from the top to the bottom, and of course when you were at the bottom you had a lot of loose rock above you, and you didn't want any of that coming down on you. But this is what the stope where the miners worked looked like. Now, sometimes, especially this one particular case over at the Mizpah claim, one of Jim Butler's group, um, they had so many big veins and so many areas open that the whole area just caved in, and there was a big pit, and it collapsed in the 1920s, the late 1920s, and it basically buried all the workings down there. But luckily, there were no miners working in there. There was something else going on. I think it was a weekend or something, and they weren't doing a lot of active working in this area, and so luckily no one was hurt by this terrible calamity. But that gives you a feel for the mines and the mills of Tonopah. Well, I'm out here today at the site of the King Tonopah mine. King Tonopah was not really one of the large producers in the district, but it was the last producer. Literally, this was the last underground mine at Tonopah. They had drilled in the late 40s some ore out here that was accessible from an existing shaft. So eventually they went down the shaft and did a cross cut out to where they drilled some ore, and they mined something like 20,000 tons of ore that averaged about 1/3 of an ounce of gold and about 30 ounces of silver. And that was into the late 50s and into the 60s. And so that was the end of the story of Tonopah. Actually, most of the mines shut down in the 40s. Literally, by the time World War II came around, there just wasn't enough good ore left for the mines to continue. And so that was pretty much the end of the story for Tonopah. It produced almost $150 million worth of gold and silver, with a little more silver than gold in value. But those prices, $150 million, is at the old price of gold and silver, with gold most of the production was at $20 an ounce, and silver something less than $1 an ounce. So Tonopah was really one of the great mining camps of the West, and I hope you've enjoyed this little series that I did about Tonopah and a little bit about this famous and historic camp. It's an interesting mining area. If you ever get a chance to come take a look, I think it's worthwhile. And so thanks a lot, and good luck in all your prospecting adventures. So also I want to mention my book, Fistful of Gold. If you have more interest in learning about how to find gold and be successful as a prospector, this is the source that you want to check out. Basically, my book is an encyclopedia of everything you need to know about prospecting, from panning, sluicing, metal detecting, dry washing, to geology of gold, and even how to stake a claim. It's basically everything you need to know about prospecting, and it's available now on Amazon. You just go to Amazon and look for Fistful of Gold by Chris Ralph, and I guarantee you'll find it. Also, I have my own website, and that's, of course, free. And for more free information, just go to nevadaoutbackgems.com/prospect/chrisprospect.htm. That's the URL for it, and it's got all kinds of information about prospecting and mining and the whole thing, everything you wanted to know, including some great history and locations of where you might want to prospect for gold. And finally, if you like this presentation and you want to learn more about finding your own gold, I promise that I've got quite a few more gold, silver, and gemstone videos coming that are on the way. A lot of exciting and interesting stuff, both in the form of live action videos as well as slide presentations. So be sure to click the subscribe button and the notification bell, and YouTube will let you know when I publish new stuff. And hit the like button as well, and feel free to comment or ask questions, and I promise to do my very best to answer any of your questions as best I can. So thanks a lot, and hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you again soon.